Welcome to our new podcast, Education to Action with the Institute for Common Power. We have things to share, movements to create, and a world to change. We're going to help you historicize our modern world as we use history to inspire change. I'm Dr. Terry Ann Scott, former professor of African American history, your host, and the director of the Institute for Common Power. I am joined by Dr. Yohuru Williams, professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at St. Thomas University in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Welcome, Dr. Williams. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Dr. Scott. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So I'm very excited about you being here because you are bringing a perspective to what's happening in the world that we don't often hear, and I think we need to dissect this. And then at the end of this, we're going to talk about hope and change and inspiration and what we can do to create change, because people are looking for that, and I think we have some ideas around that. And I want all of our podcasts, every time we come together, for that to be where we leave things. But first, damn, stuff is messed up right now. When I turn on the television, when I pick up the phone, it is very easy and read the news to lose hope, because I am watching a president who seems to be trying to cement fascism, trying to cement a level of white supremacy in cities across the country, but not all cities. He has rolled the National Guard into D.C., claiming that there is a crime epidemic of historic proportion, when in fact crime is down significantly, has threatened to do the same in Baltimore, where crime is down and to a low that it's been since 1978, and threatening to do it to other cities across the country, all of them with a through line of having a black mayor in blue-dominated spaces. This is about something more, and we need to understand this and wake up to some realities. It's about multiple things. So what I'm going to say with that is go. What do you have to tell us about this?
Yeah, I appreciate your analysis, Dr. Scott, because the other thing that these cities have in common, particularly the short list of cities he identified in the press conference, Baltimore, Oakland, is these are also sites where there have been incidents of police brutality, which led to, in many instances, federal or state consent decrees because of the over-policing of Black and brown people. Mm-hmm. Baltimore, of course, was the site of the killing of Freddie Gray, which led to these innovative approaches to policing, which is one of the reasons that crime is down in that community, because of leadership of elected authorities in that community. Oakland, which was under consent decree, one of the longest cities under consent decree for more than 20 years because of their problems with policing. And interestingly enough, I know you know, the home of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in 1966 over the issue of policing, over policing. Right. The irony in many of these instances is that these forces in DC are not being deployed to neighborhoods where there remains at least the semblance of a challenge with regard to crime. They're being deployed in tourist areas, really to reify the president's appeal again to white supremacy in the veil of Make America Great Again. So this isn't really about protecting those who are most vulnerable. This is really about reifying white supremacy through the abuse of federal authority, presidential power in utilizing the National Guard in this way.
Okay, so you brought up a number of things that people have not talked about. First of all, consent decrees. A lot of people may not know what those mean. I know that you have been very actively involved in police reform in Minnesota. You've talked about it in places like Australia and other places. We have consent decrees that essentially say it is add to this, please, correct me if I'm wrong, that it is an agreement between a local policing municipality and the federal government, the Department of Justice, that says, essentially, we have a history of screwing up, of having discriminatory policing. And when we say over-policing, that includes police brutality and death that has come to the communities that they are supposed to be policing or protecting at the hands of the police. Under this current administration, he has essentially voided those consent decrees. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? And then we're going to jump more into that and exactly where those National Guardsmen have been placed, guards people have been placed in these cities across the country.
Absolutely. I mean, when Trump came in for his first term as president, one of the things that he did that a lot of people will remember is reneged on the federal government's promise to institute a consent decree in the city of Chicago because of over-policing there. And it was Attorney General Barr who had kind of delivered the blow that the Trump administration was really interested in taking the handcuffs off police. But consent decrees, as you indicated, Dr. Scott, are really these legally binding agreements between the federal government and a municipal department overseen by a judge that really deal with issues of what we would describe as constitutional policing.
Right.
State human rights, like here in Minnesota, deal with issues of human rights under the Minnesota Department of Human Rights legislation, that state legislation. But constitutional policing get to those kind of bedrock foundational issues of 14th Amendment, Fifth Amendment violations of people's constitutional rights. And they're very important because they often work in tandem with state consent decrees to ensure a modicum of professionalism and fairness in the policing of communities of color. The Trump administration simply walking away from those consent decrees was one problem, but now utilizing the Guard in this way and making the case consistently that these cities are run amok with crime, that they are gang ridden, that they're full of the homeless, and expressing his desire over and over again to take handcuffs off the police actually make these communities more vulnerable, because that's been the problem historically, is there has been no regulation on the ways that these communities were policed, so to speak. So it's a throwback really to a time when the lawlessness, or what communities of color experienced, was lawlessness not only in terms of what they experienced in their own communities, but in terms of how police occupied and policed those areas.
And I want to make, I'm so glad that you're breaking this down, because I want to make a very important point. If somebody is saying, well, if there's crime, if you don't commit crime, then you don't have to worry about being targeted by the police or arrested, that's an absolute falsity. And the statistics back that up. So what you're describing to me is a damn nightmare, right? So you're talking about communities that have been particularly vulnerable, that have, when we say over-policed, then they are the ones who, Black and brown people, have been targeted by police in those communities, and beaten for things that they haven't done, arrested or stopped. You have the patterns of stop and frisk in these communities when they are stopping Black and brown people looking for contraband, looking for something, when in actuality their white counterparts are more likely to have contraband in the cars. And so this is a form of racialized policing, a form of racialized terror that has been exacted upon these communities for so many decades. And now gloves are off. And so now in those same communities, when they said we don't need police reform, and a place like Baltimore actually was welcoming these decrees and saying, we need your help, we need the reform, we're interested in doing this. Now the Trump administration has not only backed off of those, but said we're also either going to take over your police force or add DEA, FBI, National Guardsmen into those communities, and given the green light to do whatever they feel that they need to do to individuals who live there.
Absolutely. Undermining, in many cases, Dr. Scott, one of the bedrocks of the way that people at least thought about or think about police reform, which is community policing, that you have officers who are from the communities that they are patrolling. So once you start talking about bringing in the National Guard, the FBI, the DEA, federal law enforcement into these circumstances, you're really then undermining all the hard work that's been done in places like Baltimore, Oakland, Newark, New Jersey, around really establishing deep relationship between police and community, and undermining the fragile trust that communities and the police have worked to create around police actually doing the right thing and being held accountable for violations of civil rights and just basic decency in dealing with Black and brown people.
And there's a fact that
the
we
other
need
thing you
to,
mentioned, Dr. Scott, I just should mention quickly too, is, often these consent decrees, what they talk about is a pattern or practice of abuse. And so really now what you have the president doing is undermining that notion of a pattern or practice and saying, actually, what they did before was fine. Take the handcuffs off our police, as he said infamously about the Central Park jogger case when he took out a full ad in the New York Times. At that moment, we need to take the handcuffs off the police. That was for a lot of people, the snapshot, the poster moment of what over-policing looked like in America.
When he was taking out that ad to say essentially that we should kill 5 teenagers, Black and Afro-Latino teenagers, who were arrested falsely for claims of having sexually assaulted a white jogger, and they were innocent.
Right.
And even when they were proven innocent, he continued to want to imprison them and called for the death penalty for them. This is what we are dealing with. It is beautiful that today, I believe 1 or 2 of them are now elected officials in New York City. So a couple of things. We have him rolling back on these consent decrees. We have what will continue to be racialized policing and racialized terror in many of these communities. And we have a historical parallel, because I'm going to sing every single day from the moon back that these communities that he is threatening to take over, and DC that he has taken over, have demonstrably lower crime rates now and are being run by Black mayors. And so one of the things that the mayor from Baltimore said, and Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, said, instead of threatening to take us over, what you should be doing is coming to us and saying, how'd you do what you did, so that we can implement that in cities across the country. But his desire is not to reduce crime in other cities. His desire is to create this facade of, as you noted, protecting white tourists, of really installing white supremacy in these areas, and a grab for power. Folks, if you don't think these are the moves of a dictator, I don't know what to say. And we need to be careful there. And I want to draw I know you have something to say about that. And then I want to draw a parallel between Black political success and Reconstruction and what's happening right now.
It feels like, Dr. Scott, although it's not been named, that this is a corrective to the Black Lives Matter movement with a White Lives Matter movement championed by a president who's so deeply invested in white supremacy that, it is, painfully obvious to even the casual observer that this isn't about protecting the most vulnerable. It's not dealing with homelessness. It is this idea of, leaning into racialized crime in a way that repeats some of the more egregious things that we heard on the campaign trail. The things he said about Haitian immigrants, for example, eating dogs, really dehumanizing segments of the population to then justify this type of police action. But you named something that was very important to me, Dr. Scott, in looking at this, is that for someone who's so deeply concerned about crime, you would imagine that then an emphasis on dealing with a known pedophile, not providing Ghislaine Maxwell an opportunity to,
Correct.
Again, the irony of this posture of wanting to be tough on crime, but then being lax on people who, quite frankly, have been convicted of serious offenses. And of course, that doesn't occupy the president's attention for obvious reasons.
The president is a felon who has not been punished for his crimes. And this is the person who is saying that we need to be hard on crimes. And he calls in the federal guard when he's manufacturing this crisis. But on January 6th, and this is noted, this should be pointed out, when there actually was a riotous event, when there was an attempt to overthrow the government, he said that he didn't have the power to call in the National Guard. He refused to do so. So where does that leave us? It feels like we're living in a dream state when we think about it in this way. And your note about being a corrective to the Black Lives Matter one is not one that we should pass by. I often talk about victory and backlash. You're a historian. We cover some of the same areas in history. And we know that when we have victory, particularly around victory from communities of color, from African-American communities, we then have, and from brown communities, from women, we then have from LGBTQIA plus communities, we then have a pushback. And that has happened historically in this country. So I said we want to talk about Reconstruction and that pushback, Black Lives Matter and that pushback, 2020 and the successes that we found after a pandemic that revealed very much racial disparities in the ways that healthcare was administered to Black people, that revealed how policing, whether from vigilantes, like in the case of Ahmaud Arbery or others, was so racialized. When George Floyd in your own town was lynched, the response to people having the kind of awakening was DEI measures, was more inclusivity. So what we're watching right now by illegalizing DEI, by calling for CRT to be quelled in kindergarten, when, by the way, it's not taught in kindergarten, that's a backlash to 2020. That's a corrective to the gains that we made. And so we're still in that right now. We're still in a corrective to some of the successes that were made. And some of the successes that we see is a continuing increase in Black political power. Right. And so we have Baltimore with a Black mayor. We have Los Angeles with a Black mayor. We have DC with a Black mayor. During Reconstruction, and let's talk a little bit about that, because during Reconstruction, we have the highest level of Black political participation in the country, largely because of the presence of Union troops who said that we are going to make sure Black people are not being murdered, which they were when they were trying to vote, and mostly significantly because of Black people's desire to participate in the political process. And so men are voting, women are accompanying men to the polls, they are having constitutional conventions, and we have upwards of 2,000 Black elected officials. One of the first things that was done at the end of Reconstruction, 1877, was to what? Undermine Black political power. White Southerners said no more Negro rule. They didn't just do it with literacy tests and poll tax. In the state of Georgia, they actually murdered Black legislators to make sure that they couldn't take their seat. No more Black political power. What can we do to undermine it? In Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, they issued a handbook on how to demonize Black politicians, on how to call them brutes and say that they are assaulting white women, to say that they were crooked, anything that they could do to undermine their intelligence. It's much like when Trump calls Representative Jasmine Crockett, unintelligent, even though she holds a law degree and is far more intelligent than he could ever hope to be. What parallel do you see between that time and what's happening right now with this taking over of these Black-run cities?
Any number, Dr. Scott, and I appreciate the way that you laid that out, because for me, when I think about this, I also think about the willing accomplice that the end of Reconstruction, those who were looking to end Reconstruction had in the United States Supreme Court, and a series of decisions rendered at the end of Reconstruction, which really facilitated the work of that rollback of the gains that had been made in that period of when Black people, finally had an opportunity through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to experience to borrow a phrase, new birth of freedom. Yeah. So I think about U.S. versus Reese, U.S. versus Cruikshank, U.S. versus Harris, where, as you talked about the violence in Georgia or Wilmington, North Carolina, Colfax, the infamous Colfax massacre, where African Americans are massacred, and then the men who participate in that violence, the Supreme Court narrowly interprets sections of the Enforcement Act, actually renders sections of that act unconstitutional, says that this is a state crime, and actually then turns that over to a state court, where in fact there was every guarantee at that point that these men would not be found guilty of the crime of murder. So
hold on Colfax. Don't pass by that, because Colfax, most people listening won't know what that is. It's something that happened in a parish in Louisiana, and it looked a lot like January 6th, because you had a group of white citizens, Klansmen, politicians who wanted to take power back from the elected officials inside of that courthouse. And the elected officials mostly inside that courthouse at that time were Black. And so they fired cannons into the courthouse. They murdered a number of them. And it sounds a lot like January 6th, because they were also not held accountable for what they did.
Actually, it's such a great parallel, because that case in particular, I think, is one that we should revisit more often, particularly in teaching, because it's instructive in terms of the role of the U.S. Supreme Court. We often today think about the Supreme Court in the Brown context as this organization that has delivered rights by interpreting. We think about that in terms of women's rights, LGBTQ+. We often don't talk about the ways in which the Supreme Court has been an impediment to, or has helped to restrict rights. And those Civil War cases, or Reconstruction cases, are a good example of that. So, I think about that. I also think about this in the context of what's happening here in St. Paul. We've had a cyber attack against the city of St. Paul, Black Mayor Melvin Carter. And the reality that the federal government is so wrought up over, supposedly dealing with crime in Washington, D.C., which is declining, that the federal government hasn't been, they should be concerned about these cyber attacks on American cities, which is a national security concern and should be elevated to national attention. So to your point again, I
should
think
be concerned about school shootings as well. Because if it was Black men who were primarily the ones going into the schools and killing children, then Black men would be rounded up, and we don't know what would happen. But I digress.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Dr. Williams.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And I think the starkness of that comparison and the fact that it's undeniable in this moment should give pause to everyone. But, what we're seeing as usual with Trump is his ability to, I have to give him credit for this. I mean, I'm mystified by it. Masterfully parry these charges and somehow say nothing to see here, or don't believe what you're seeing. But those of us who are steeped in this history know. And in communities of color, for Black folks in particular, this is nothing new. I think that those who don't understand the grief that came before the grief, that ultimately the price to be paid for this, not only in terms of the dollars that will be expended to sustain this unnecessary show of force in the District of Columbia, but in the loss of civil rights,
Hmm.
and constitutional rights, they'll realize much too late. And then we're going to have to talk about a fourth or fifth reconstruction,
Yeah.
but this time it won't be about black civil rights, it'll be about the American experiment.
And many people, I think, have realized much too late who regret their vote, but it is too late because now all of the things that we had warned individuals about are coming to fruition. I mean, it's a handbook not only from Project 2025, but from other past events and trials in the ways that they're restricting truth in schools, in the ways that they are policing communities. And your point that you're making about the federal government and things that are executed on the ground only being enabled by the Supreme Court, you're right. The Supreme Court, while they did issue something like Worley versus Buchanan or Brown versus Board and things that were really correctives to injustice, at the same time, Jim Crow and voter disenfranchisement and so many of the other things that really have plagued communities for decades were green-lighted because of other Supreme Court rulings. And that's one of the reasons why then Trump taking control of the Supreme Court and putting those individuals, not just Trump, I hate to just say Trump, but the individuals around him and the individuals who put him in power, taking control and putting in individuals they want in the Supreme Court, then allows them to solidify many of their convictions and their ideas about what constitutes a great nation and codify that, right, with very little resistance and make sure that that lasts for generations, or at least that's the attempt. And so if we have some people then who regret the vote that they cast and people are beginning to wake up, we still have a number of people who are solidly committed to this man. And once when he said that he could end a person's life in Times Square and nobody would say anything about it, you wonder how truthful that statement rings for so many of his followers. So you have some of those who are just fallen to cognitive dissonance, who may not be able to be reached. But I firmly believe that through education, through acknowledgement, through pushing of the truth, that we are able to reach the hearts and minds of so many. That's why some of the information that we are putting here, that we may see, that continues to push the reality of crime rates being down in these cities, continues to push the reality of what is the subtext behind what he's doing. We have to keep pushing. We have to arm people with the fodder necessary to argue with others, to change other people's minds. That's one of the things we need to do. We need to commit to understanding, to learning, to researching so that we can deliver those tools to other people. What is something else that in this moment we can do?
I love that question, Dr. Scott. You and I are both big fans of John Lewis, and I think he gave us a beautiful playbook for that. In that final letter to the American people, ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in good trouble, necessary trouble. But people then who stop at just the good trouble, necessary trouble miss what he says in that next paragraph, which is that voting is essential, but people should recognize that the right to vote can be lost. We need to read and study the lessons of the past because society's been involved in this existential struggle for a very long time. And we need to build kinship with people, not just in our nation, but across the globe who are dealing with similar challenges, and to learn from the lessons of the past.
Right.
It is, for me, the work of the Institute, for example, that champions and spearheads that, and then allows people through the history to recognize, for example, if we're going to make comparisons, what are the other times that we've seen presidents act in this way? And it underscores something that Daryl Scott said on, Professor Daryl Scott said on social media a few weeks ago, which I found interesting. I'm not going to do it justice, but he said, people of color win rights, but often lose culture wars. And so we really need to be focused on the rights battles right now. When, for example, Eisenhower calls out the National Guard in Little Rock, he federalizes the National Guard because Oral Faubus is trying to deny a Supreme Court ruling that then, through Brown versus Board of Education, facilitated the entry of the Little Rock Nine into schools.
And misused the federal guard himself. The governor at that time of Arkansas misused the federal guard to prevent what the Supreme Court said was supposed to happen. That is a case of the president coming in and federalizing the National Guard in a moment that is necessary, much like Lincoln did during the Civil War. So we can point to those historical moments when it's necessary, when it is understandable, not when it is based on a falsity and somebody's own notion of grabbing of power.
Absolutely. I love that. And I also think about the one that always stands out to me is John Kennedy in 62, Oxford, Mississippi.
Yes.
Activating the Mississippi National Guard to protect James Meredith because his life was then. So, I think if we
After
could,
another student had been murdered on campus because people were rioting to prevent James Meredith from entering the school. So if
it,
people want to point to instances when the National Guard was federalized by the president, those are instances when we can argue was totally necessary,
it's fun
not
doing
meant.
this with you, Dr. Scott, because you're pointing to the real jeopardy and vulnerability of life in that moment.
Right.
And it exposes this as a sham right
Yes.
now.
Yes.
Like, this is not about a real concern about the potential for the loss of life or damage
No.
to property or whatever it may be. This is really a power grab. And I think DC
Yeah.
Mayor Muriel Bowser said it eloquently. It might have taken her a while to get there, but I think she named it when she came out and said, we really need to be thinking about the pushback against this authoritarian effort to take over
Yes.
these cities and states.
Right. And two things about that. One thing that I don't want to leave, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what we can do, but leave without saying, is that the other thing that's happened is that his Fox News host turned district attorney there has promised to prosecute youth in DC as adults. And so we know that's Black and brown youth. And so
Right.
we think about each individual child who's 14 or 15 and is brought in for a crime and prosecuted as an adult with another life destroyed. And so that's the other direction that we're heading in. You talked about voting. That is what we do. Two things. At the Institute for Common Power, we use the past to create change for the future. That means looking to the past for strategies from what people did, for resilience, for perseverance, and saying we need to apply those ideas to today. Because I always say if they could do that, we can do this. That's number one. We learn from the past, and you don't just read the book for history. You read that information. You come to our lectures. You learn so that you know what is possible. Number two, we are an educational branch of Common Power. So if you go to commonpower.org, you can register to be a volunteer and to be deployed across this country to organize volunteers, to bring people out to vote, to register people to vote. Because if you say your vote doesn't matter, guess what? It matters so damn much that one political party, Republicans, are trying everything that they can do to purge people from the voter rolls, to gerrymander states like Texas and now hints of states like South Carolina and Indiana to prevent your vote from mattering. Your vote matters so much that people are going to great lengths to make sure that you can't cast it. So we can do something about that. Dr. Williams, I'm going to give you the last word.
I would simply underscore, I love and have been so appreciative of the work of Common Power, because I think about that final letter to the American people from John Lewis, where he says the vote is the most important tool that we have, nonviolent tool that we have in our arsenal. We should use it or we could lose it. I think now it is painfully evident that the prospects of the loss of the vote and what we're seeing across this country is indicative of the importance of the work of Common Power, but also a reminder to all of us that, the work of preserving democratic institutions falls equally to all of us, and everyone has
Yes.
to be willing to do their part in order to preserve the same.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for being here. One day the world will be lighter and we'll get on here and we'll just talk about what our kids are doing and what we're about to do for the weekend. But for now, we have this to attend to. It is always fantastic to talk to you about things. You will be back soon, I hope. And have a wonderful day. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dr. Scott.
Talk
Good seeing
soon.
you.
Take care.